The late afternoon sun hung low over the city, casting long, stretched shadows across the busy highway. Inside a simple, dark sedan, Keanu Reeves sat in the back seat, his elbow resting against the cool glass of the window. He looked tired, the kind of tired that goes deep into the bones and doesn't go away with sleep. He wasn't wearing a fancy suit or clothes that cost thousands of dollars. He was dressed in a faded t-shirt, an old leather jacket that had seen better days, and a pair of scuffed boots. To anyone looking in from the outside, he looked just like any other regular guy trying to get home after a long week at work. But Keanu wasn't going home. He was heading to the airport with a heavy heart and a prayer in his mind. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, glanced at the clock on the dashboard and then back at the road. The traffic was terrible. Cars were bumper to bumper, their red brake lights glowing in a river of metal that seemed to have no end. Keanu let out a slow, shaky breath. He checked his phone again. No new messages. That was good, but it was also bad. No news meant his friend was still holding on, but every minute that ticked by was a minute he wasn't by his side. He closed his eyes for a second and remembered the phone call from 2 days ago. His childhood friend, the one who used to ride bikes with him down the steep hills of their neighborhood, was in the hospital. The doctors had said there wasn't much time left. Keanu had promised he would be there. He had promised he wouldn't let his friend go through this alone. But the movie set had run late. A scene that should have taken 2 hours to film had taken all day. Now he was racing against the clock. "Sir, I'm sorry," the driver said, his voice quiet and apologetic. "This jam is worse than I thought. It might be tight getting you to the terminal on time." Keanu opened his eyes and looked forward. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just nodded. "Just do your best," he said softly. "Thank you for driving me." The traffic inched forward. Keanu looked out the window at the people in other cars, a woman laughing at a joke on the radio, a teenager drumming on a steering wheel. Life was moving all around him, but he felt stuck in a bubble of silence and worry. He thought about his friend. He thought about the summers they spent swimming in the lake, the secrets they shared, and the dreams they talked about under the stars. Those were the moments that mattered, not the movie premieres. Not the bright lights of Hollywood, just the simple, quiet moments of friendship. He gripped the strap of his old duffel bag tighter. It was packed with a few changes of clothes, some books, and a framed photo of the two of them from high school. That was all he needed. Finally, the car broke free of the traffic jam. The driver accelerated, weaving carefully through the lanes. The airport rose up in the distance, a massive structure of glass and steel. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but Keanu couldn't enjoy it. He just watched the runway lights flicker on in the distance. They pulled up to the departure curb. The car barely stopped before Keanu opened the door. He stepped out, the noise of the airport instantly hitting him. The roar of jet engines, the sound of taxis honking, the chatter of hundreds of people. He slung his bag over his shoulder. He reached into his pocket to pay the driver, but the driver waved him off. "Get going," the driver said with a smile. "I hope you make it. Good luck, sir." Keanu paused for a split second. He looked the driver in the eyes and offered a genuine, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said. "Take care." He didn't act like a big shot. He didn't throw money around. He was just a man saying thanks. He turned and walked toward the automatic sliding glass doors that led into the terminal. As he entered, the air conditioning hit his face, cool and crisp. The terminal was packed. It was a sea of humanity. Families with screaming children, business people on their phones, elderly couples holding hands. Keanu pulled the brim of his baseball cap down lower. He wasn't trying to be rude. He just wanted to be invisible. He didn't want to sign autographs or take selfies right now. He just wanted to get to the gate. He joined the line at the security checkpoint. It was long. He stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, checking the time every few seconds. The line moved at a snail's pace. A group of tourists in front of him was arguing about where to put their bags. Keanu closed his eyes and took a deep breath to stay calm. He thought about his friend lying in a hospital bed, waiting. The distance between them felt like a million miles. When it was finally his turn, he moved quickly. He placed his bag on the belt. He took off his jacket and his boots. He walked through the metal scanner, arms raised. A security guard looked at him, then at his ID, then back at him. The guard's eyes widened slightly. He recognized the face. But Keanu just gave a small, tired nod. The guard, sensing the urgency and the sadness in the actor's eyes, didn't say a word. He just waved him through. Keanu grabbed his things, not even bothering to put his boots back on properly. He just shoved his feet in, grabbed his bag, and started to run. He had to get to gate 42. It was at the very end of the terminal, a long walk away. He started jogging past the shops and restaurants. He passed a newsstand with magazines featuring his face on the cover. He passed a coffee shop smelling of roasted beans. He didn't stop. He didn't look. His focus was entirely on the gate number signs hanging from the ceiling. Gate 10, Gate 15, Gate 20. His breathing grew heavy. The leather jacket felt heavy on his shoulders. His bag bumped against his hip with every step. People stared as he ran past. Some pointed, some whispered. "Is that?" he heard someone ask, but he didn't stop. He was sweating now, his shirt sticking to his back. He wasn't running from the paparazzi. He wasn't running towards a movie set. He was running towards a goodbye. He reached the moving walkways and jumped on one, but it was too slow. He couldn't stand still. He walked fast on the moving belt, passing people who were standing relaxed. He looked at the departure boards hanging above. His flight was listed. It said boarding. It didn't say closed yet. There was still a chance. The terminal seemed to stretch on forever. The floor was polished stone, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. The announcements over the speaker system were garbled and loud, calling out names and flight numbers. It was a chaotic symphony of travel. Keanu's heart was pounding in his chest, not from the running, but from the fear of being too late. He thought about the last time he saw his friend. They had laughed about old times. They had promised to meet up sooner. Life got in the way, work got in the way. Regret started to bubble up in his throat, tasting bitter. He finally saw the sign for Gate 40. He was close. He turned the corner and saw the long corridor leading to Gate 42. The glass walls revealed the airplane parked outside. The huge metal bird was connected to the building by a long, enclosed tunnel called a jet bridge. Keanu slowed his pace slightly, trying to catch his breath. He didn't want to walk onto the plane looking like a mess, but he didn't have a choice. He just needed to get on that plane. He could see the entrance to the jet bridge. There was a small desk where the gate agents usually sat, but they were inside the aircraft cabin now, finishing up the paperwork. Standing at the very entrance of the bridge, checking a clipboard, was the pilot. The pilot was a tall man with a crisp uniform and a cap that shadowed his eyes. He looked professional, serious, and in control. Keanu took a deep breath and adjusted his cap. He walked toward the jet bridge, his boots echoing on the floor. He was so close. He was just a few feet away. He could see the pilot looking down at his papers, checking off names. Keanu prepared his boarding pass on his phone, his thumb shaking slightly as he unlocked the screen. He was ready to board. He was ready to get to his friend. But as he got within a few steps of the entrance, the pilot looked up. Their eyes met. And in that split second, the atmosphere shifted completely. The pilot didn't see a tired man running to say goodbye to a dying friend. He saw a disheveled stranger rushing toward his plane. And he didn't like it. The pilot stood straight as a rod, his back to the busy terminal, checking the last of the details on his clipboard. He was a man who took pride in precision. To him, an airplane wasn't just a vehicle. It was a giant metal machine that required absolute respect and strict adherence to rules. He had a schedule to keep, a manifest to balance, and a cabin full of passengers waiting for the smooth hum of the engines to take them into the sky. He didn't like surprises, and he certainly didn't like stragglers. In his world, if you weren't at the gate 10 minutes before departure, you weren't flying. It was that simple. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of running boots on the polished floor behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know someone was coming in hot. It was a sound he had heard 100 times before, the sound of someone who didn't respect the clock. He frowned, his jaw tightening slightly. He finished his note, turned slowly, and positioned himself squarely in the center of the jet bridge entrance. Keanu skidded to a halt just a few feet away. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving up and down. The run from the security checkpoint had taken everything out of him. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dampened the collar of his faded t-shirt. He looked messy, frantic, and desperate. He gripped his phone tightly in his hand, the screen glowing with the digital image of his boarding pass. "I'm here," Keanu gasped, his voice raspy and dry. I made it, I have a ticket. He held the phone up, offering it to the pilot like a peace treaty. His eyes were wide, pleading, filled with a raw intensity that went beyond just wanting a seat. He was looking at the pilot not as a celebrity to a worker, but as one human soul begging another for help. The pilot didn't even glance at the phone. He looked at the man standing in front of him. He saw the wild hair, the heavy breathing, the disheveled clothes. In his line of work, he had to be a judge of character. He had to spot trouble before it walked onto his plane. And right now, this man looked like trouble. He looked erratic. He looked like someone who might cause a scene at 30,000 feet. The door is closed, sir, the pilot said. His voice was deep, authoritative, and utterly final. He didn't shout, but the command in his tone was sharp enough to cut through the noise of the terminal. You cannot board, Keanu blinked, stunned. He took a half step forward, his hand trembling slightly. Please, he said, the desperation thick in his voice. It's an emergency. I have to get to New York, my friend. He's dying. I'm the only one he has left. I just need to get on this plane. He wasn't acting. He wasn't reading from a script. This was the raw truth of his life spilling out onto the cold floor of the terminal. He thought if he just explained, if the pilot understood the weight of the situation, the door would open. Surely compassion would win over a schedule, but the pilot didn't see a grieving friend. He saw a man making up stories to get his way. He heard emergency, and his internal alarms rang louder. He saw a man who was overly emotional and unpredictable. To the pilot, this was a safety risk. He couldn't have a passenger having a breakdown in the middle of the flight because of some personal crisis. Step back, the pilot commanded, taking a step forward to reinforce his position. He folded his arms across his chest, a wall of uniform and authority. I don't care what the reason is, the door is sealed, the paperwork is finalized, we are pushing back in 2 minutes. You are not getting on this aircraft. But I called ahead, Keanu tried again, his voice cracking. He looked at the closed glass door behind the pilot as if he could will it to open with his eyes. They said at the counter that if I hurried. They were wrong, the pilot snapped. He pointed a gloved finger toward the terminal seats. Now step away from the entrance. I will not ask you again. Keanu stood there, frozen. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him. The seconds were ticking away, turning into minutes that he couldn't get back. He felt a scream building up in his chest, a cry of unfairness and frustration. He wanted to beg. He wanted to drop to his knees. He wanted to tell this pilot that he didn't understand, that this wasn't about a vacation, this was about saying goodbye. But then he looked at the pilot's face. He saw the hard set of the jaw, the impatience in the eyes, the hand hovering near the call button for security. Keanu realized that fighting wasn't going to work. Arguing wasn't going to open that door. If he caused a scene, security would come and he would be dragged away in handcuffs. That wouldn't help his friend. That wouldn't honor anyone. So Keanu did the hardest thing he had ever done. He swallowed the scream. He forced the panic down deep inside him, burying it under a layer of profound, aching dignity. He stopped leaning forward. He lowered the hand holding the phone. The pilot watched him, expecting a fight. He expected shouting. He expected the man to lose control. That was usually how these things went. But the transformation in the stranger was startling. The frantic energy seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a heavy, quiet sadness. Keanu looked the pilot right in the eye. There was no anger there. There was no hatred, just a deep, sorrowful acceptance. He gave a small, slow nod. It was a nod of respect, acknowledging the pilot's power over the situation, even if he disagreed with the decision. Okay, Keanu whispered. The word was barely audible over the hum of the terminal. Okay, I understand. He didn't say another word. He didn't try to push past. He didn't bang on the glass. He simply stood there for a moment, looking at the pilot as if to say, I hope you never have to run for something that matters this much. Then Keanu turned around. It was a slow movement. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, which felt like it weighed 1,000 tons now. He kept his head up, but his shoulders slumped just a fraction. He began to walk back the way he came, back toward the hard plastic chairs of the waiting area. The pilot watched him go. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, feeling a sense of relief that the confrontation was over. He checked his watch, right on time. He had done his job. He had protected his aircraft and his schedule. He turned his back to the terminal and pressed the button to signal the ground crew. The massive engines of the plane began to spool up outside the window, vibrating the floor beneath his feet. From the other side of the thick glass partition, Keanu found an empty seat near a large potted plant. He sat down heavily, the leather squeaking against the plastic. He dropped his bag on the floor. He looked out the window at the plane. He could see the wing, the blinking lights, the machinery that was going to take everyone else to their destination while he stayed behind. He pulled his phone out of his pocket. He stared at the background photo. It was a picture of him and his friend, laughing, covered in mud after a long hike. He touched the screen with his thumb, tracing the lines of his friend's face. He felt a tear escape his eye and roll down his cheek, hot and fast. He quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of his jacket. He didn't want to cry here, not in front of all these people. Inside the jet bridge, the pilot finalized his checks. He walked down the long, narrow corridor, the walls curving around him. He stepped into the cockpit and sat in his seat. He put on his headset and began to talk to air traffic control. He felt good. He felt in control. He had handled a difficult passenger professionally. He had avoided a delay. As the plane began to push back from the gate, the pilot glanced out the side window of the cockpit. He could see the terminal building sliding past. He could see the rows of windows, bright with artificial light. For a brief second, he wondered if that man was still standing there, watching. He felt a tiny pang of something, guilt perhaps, but he pushed it away. The rules were the rules. You can't make exceptions for everyone. If he let one guy on, where do you draw the line? No, he had done the right thing. He was sure of it. The plane turned onto the taxiway. The terminal gate where Keanu sat drifted out of view. Back at the gate, Keanu watched the plane move. It looked so graceful from a distance, so effortless. He watched it until it was just a silver speck among the lights of the runway. He let out a long sigh, the kind that empties your lungs completely. He looked around at the other people in the terminal. They were eating sandwiches, typing on laptops, laughing with their families. The world kept spinning. It didn't stop because he was heartbroken. He picked up his bag and stood up. He didn't know what he was going to do next. He would have to find another flight. He would have to wait, but for now he just felt the heavy silence of the moment. He had missed his chance. And the pilot, sitting comfortably in the cockpit, had no idea that in refusing entry to a passenger, he had also cut short a final goodbye. The mistake was made, sealed tight like the door of the plane, and currently taxiing toward the runway. The silence that followed the plane's departure was heavy and loud. It pressed against Keanu's ears like a physical weight. The giant metal bird had lifted off the concrete, soared into the darkening sky, and taken with it his last hope of making it to the hospital on time. He stood by the large window, his forehead resting lightly against the cool glass, watching the blinking red lights of the aircraft until they disappeared into the clouds. He didn't move. He couldn't. His feet felt like they were encased in concrete. For a man who spent his life running, jumping, and fighting on movie sets, being forced to stand still was the hardest torture of all. Around him, the gate area was emptying out. The last few passengers had scrambled down the jet bridge just before the door was sealed, and now the cleaning crew was beginning to arrive. They wore blue uniforms and pushed large carts filled with trash bags. They moved efficiently, wiping down seats and picking up discarded newspapers and plastic cups. They didn't notice the man standing by the window, or if they did, they didn't care. To them, he was just another traveler who had missed his flight, a common sight in the world of airports. They went about their work, chatting quietly in a language Keanu didn't understand, their voices a low hum that only deepened his sense of isolation. Keanu finally pushed himself away from the window. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, messy hair, a face full of worry. He adjusted his baseball cap, pulling the brim down lower. He needed to move. He needed to do something. Standing here feeling sorry for himself wasn't going to help his friend. He picked up his old duffel bag, swung it over his shoulder, and began the long walk back toward the main terminal. The walk felt endless. The airport seemed like a different place now that the rush was over. The bright fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floors, creating a harsh, clinical atmosphere. He passed rows of empty chairs that had been filled with people just minutes ago. He passed a newsstand where the magazines were neatly stacked, the covers featuring smiling celebrities and glossy ads. It all felt so fake to him in that moment, like a movie set he had wandered onto by accident. The real world, where life and death happened, was thousands of miles away, and he was stuck in this in-between place with nothing but time to think. As he walked, his mind raced with regrets. He thought about the filming schedule, he thought about the traffic, he thought about the pilot. The anger he had suppressed earlier began to bubble up again, hot and sharp. He replayed the scene in his mind. The pilot's cold face, the dismissive tone, the absolute refusal to listen. It wasn't just about following the rules, it was about the lack of humanity. The pilot had looked at him and seen a problem, not a person. He had seen a disheveled man in a hurry and decided he didn't belong. Keanu hated that. He hated that the world could be so judgmental, so quick to block someone out based on how they looked or how they sounded. But then he pushed the anger down. Anger wouldn't get him there. He had to focus. He had to find another way. He pulled out his phone and checked the flight board again. There was another flight to New York late that night, but it was listed as full. There was an early morning flight in 6 hours. 6 hours. It felt like a lifetime. His friend might not have 6 hours. The thought made his stomach hurt. He clicked off the screen and kept walking, his boots making a lonely rhythm on the floor. He arrived at the customer service desk in the center of the terminal. The line was long, snaking back and forth between velvet ropes. It was filled with people who had also missed their flights or whose flights had been canceled. They looked tired, frustrated, and defeated. A mother was trying to quiet a crying baby while bouncing a toddler on her hip. A businessman in a suit was shouting into his phone about a meeting he was going to miss. The air in the line was thick with stress. Keanu took his place at the back of the line. He didn't complain. He didn't try to cut in front, even though he knew who he was and knew that he probably could have if he wanted to. He stood there, just like everyone else, a traveler in need of help. He watched the people ahead of him. He saw the worry on their faces. He realized that everyone here had a story, everyone was going somewhere important to them, and everyone was facing an obstacle. It was a humbling moment. He wasn't the main character in the world. He was just one of many people trying to get home. The line moved slowly. When he finally reached the front, a woman was sitting behind the counter. She looked exhausted. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She typed furiously on her keyboard, not looking up. "Next," she called out, her voice flat. Keanu stepped up to the counter. He placed his phone on the counter, his boarding pass still glowing on the screen. "Hi," he said softly. "I missed the last flight. I need to get to New York as soon as possible." "It's a family emergency." The woman sighed, a long, weary sound. She finally looked up. Her eyes scanned him, taking in the worn jacket, the baseball cap, the tired eyes. She saw a man who looked like he had been through the ringer. "Let me see what I can do," she said, her tone softening just a fraction. She took his name and typed it into her computer. She frowned at the screen. "The late flight is oversold. I can put you on standby, but I can't promise anything." She looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "The earliest confirmed seat is on the 6:00 a.m. flight tomorrow morning. That's 5 hours from now." Keanu felt his heart sink. 5 hours, it was too long, but he had no choice. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet. "Put me on the standby list for tonight, and book the morning one just in case." The woman nodded and printed out a new ticket. As she tore it off the printer, she glanced at the name on the ticket. She paused. She looked at the name, then looked up at the man standing in front of her. Her eyes went wide. She looked at his nose, the shape of his jaw, the way he stood. The realization hit her like a splash of cold water. "Wait," she whispered. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice so the people in line behind him wouldn't hear. Are you him?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't put on a celebrity smile. He just looked at her with sad, honest eyes. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The woman's hand trembled slightly as she held out the ticket. "I'm so sorry," she said, and this time her voice was full of genuine warmth. "I didn't recognize you at first. I heard about what happened at the gate. Someone said a guy got turned away. I didn't know it was you." She looked at him with deep sympathy. She could see the pain etched on his face. "Is it true what they said, that you're rushing to the hospital?" Keanu nodded slowly. He didn't want to talk about it, but he saw kindness in her eyes and he couldn't lie to her. "Yes, my friend, he doesn't have much time." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She felt terrible. Here was this man, this famous actor everyone loved, treated like a nobody just moments ago, and she was about to send him to a waiting chair for 5 hours. She wished she had a magic wand to make a plane appear. She wished she was the pilot. "I'll do my best on the standby list," she said fiercely. "I'll call the gate for the late flight personally. I'll tell them who you are. I'll make sure they know." "Thank you," Keanu said. He reached out and took the ticket. "Thank you for your kindness." He turned away from the counter and walked toward the security checkpoint, which was now quiet and dark. He found a row of empty seats near a large window overlooking the tarmac. He sat down. The chair was hard and uncomfortable. He placed his bag on his lap and hugged it close to his chest. He watched the planes outside. They moved like fireflies in the night, their lights blinking in the darkness. He thought about the pilot who had refused him. He wondered if the pilot was looking out the window right now, sipping coffee, feeling good about his decision. He wondered if the pilot would ever know the truth, or if he would just go home to his family and forget about the disheveled man he left behind. Keanu pulled out his phone again. He stared at the photo of his friend. "I'm trying," he whispered to the screen. "I'm really trying." He leaned his head back against the cold wall and closed his eyes. He was exhausted, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. He would just wait. He would wait for the woman at the counter to call or for the morning sun to rise. But deep down, in the quiet place where hope lives, he knew he might be too late. And that was a reality he wasn't sure he was strong enough to face. The terminal was silent now, save for the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner and the occasional announcement over the intercom. He was alone in the crowd, just a man with a broken heart, waiting for a second chance. The plane was now 30,000 feet in the air, slicing through the cool night sky at hundreds of miles per hour. Inside the cockpit, everything was calm. The hum of the engines was steady and rhythmic, a comforting sound that the pilot had listened to for thousands of hours over his career. The lights on the control panel glowed soft green and amber, casting a gentle glow on his face. He took a sip of his coffee, which was still hot, and leaned back in his seat. Below him, the city lights of the departure city were fading into the darkness, becoming nothing more than a fuzzy memory. The pilot felt good. He felt a sense of satisfaction that came from a job well done. The flight had left on time. The passengers were safe. The fuel burn was exactly where it was supposed to be. In his line of work, a smooth departure was a victory. He prided himself on being a no-nonsense captain. He didn't let people push him around, and he didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. Rules existed for a reason, safety and efficiency, and he stuck to them. As he adjusted the radio dial to speak with air traffic control, he thought about the man at the gate. The memory was already fading, filed away in his mind as just another minor disturbance in a long career. Next to him, the co-pilot was fiddling with his tablet computer. They were cruising now, which meant there was a brief lull in the heavy workload. The co-pilot was a younger man, eager to learn, but he also liked to keep up with the news and social media during the quiet times. Suddenly, the co-pilot let out a low whistle. "Captain," he said, his voice filled with surprise. "You aren't going to believe what is popping up on the news feeds and social media right now." The pilot didn't look away from the windscreen, where the stars were shining brightly against the black void. "Air traffic delays?" he asked, his voice bored. "Weather issues?" "No, nothing like that," the co-pilot said, turning the tablet around so the pilot could see the screen. "It's about our departure gate. Someone at the terminal posted a photo. It's going viral." The pilot glanced down at the screen, expecting to see a picture of a crying baby or a broken piece of equipment. Instead, he saw a grainy photo taken from a distance. It showed the entrance to the jet bridge. And there, standing with his back to the camera, walking away with slumped shoulders, was a man in a worn leather jacket and a baseball cap. The pilot recognized the jacket immediately. It was the man he had turned away just minutes before takeoff. He frowned. "So, someone missed a flight." "Why is that news?" "Read the caption, Captain," the co-pilot said, his voice hushed. "Look at the name." The pilot squinted at the text on the screen. The headline was bold and dramatic. Hollywood star denied boarding while racing to dying friend's bedside. The pilot felt a sudden jolt of confusion. He looked closer at the photo. The man was walking away, but the profile was visible. The messy hair, the nose, the way he walked, it was unmistakable. Keanu Reeves, the pilot whispered, the name feeling strange in his mouth. That was Keanu Reeves, the co-pilot nodded, scrolling through the comments. People are angry, Captain. They are saying he was running to catch a flight to say goodbye to a childhood friend who is in critical condition. He was begging to get on. A cold, heavy feeling dropped into the pilot's stomach. It felt like a stone had settled there, weighing him down. He stared at the photo on the screen. He remembered the man's face. He remembered the desperate look in his eyes, the pleading tone of his voice. It's an emergency, my friend. Dying, the pilot had heard those words, but he had filtered them out as lies. He had assumed it was just another traveler making up an excuse to get past the rules. He reached out and took the tablet from the co-pilot. His hands were trembling slightly. He scrolled through an article. It described how Keanu had rushed from a film set, fighting through traffic, only to be stopped at the final step. The article mentioned how he had accepted the refusal with dignity, how he hadn't shouted or caused a scene. The pilot read the words, and each one felt like a small pinch. I didn't recognize him, the pilot stammered, setting the tablet down on his lap. He looked so disheveled. I thought he was just some guy causing trouble. The co-pilot looked at him, his expression unreadable. He's famous for being humble, Captain. He doesn't travel with an entourage. He carries his own bags. He looks like a regular guy because that's who he is. The pilot turned back to the control panel, but the numbers and dials didn't make sense anymore. His mind was racing. He replayed the scene at the gate in high definition. He saw Keanu's hand holding out the phone, the sweat on his forehead, the raw pain in his voice when he said, "I'm the only one he has left." The realization hit the pilot with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just denied a passenger a seat. He had used his authority to block a human being from performing a final act of love. He had prioritized a schedule over a goodbye. He had looked at a man in pain and saw only a rule breaker. The cockpit suddenly felt very small. The air seemed thick and hard to breathe. The pilot had spent 30 years flying planes. He had handled engine failures, severe turbulence, and emergency landings. He had always been calm under pressure. But now, sitting in the smoothest part of the flight, he felt panic rising in his chest. "I messed up," the pilot said, his voice so low it was almost swallowed by the engine noise. "I messed up bad." The co-pilot didn't say anything. He just looked out the window, giving his captain a moment of privacy. But the silence was loud. It was the silence of judgment. The pilot thought about his own family. He thought about his mother, his brother, his friends. If he got a call that one of them was dying, wouldn't he run? Wouldn't he beg? And if some stranger in a uniform stood in his way and looked at him with disdain, how would he feel? He would feel destroyed. He realized that was exactly how Keanu Reeves felt right now. He looked out the windshield at the endless stretch of clouds below. Somewhere down there in a hospital room, a man was fighting for his life. And somewhere in an airport terminal, a friend was sitting alone, waiting for the next flight, wondering if he would make it in time. And the reason for that delay was him. The pilot touched the 4 stripes on his shoulder epaulets. They represented rank, experience, and authority. But right now, they felt like a badge of shame. "He told me the truth," the pilot whispered to himself. "He looked me in the eye and told me the truth, and I called him a liar." The co-pilot cleared his throat softly. "We can't turn the plane around, Captain. Company policy. We have a full flight and a schedule to keep to New York." The pilot knew that. He knew the rules better than anyone. But for the first time in his career, the rules felt wrong. They felt like a cage. He was trapped by the very system he had dedicated his life to. He had done everything by the book, but he had failed the basic test of being a decent human being. He looked at the fuel gauge. They had enough fuel to go for hours. But they didn't have enough time. Time was the one thing he couldn't control. He had stolen Keanu's time. He had stolen precious minutes that could never be given back. The rest of the flight passed in a blur for the captain. He went through the motions. He talked to air traffic control. He monitored the instruments. He drank his coffee, which had gone cold. But his mind was back at the gate, watching the retreating figure of a man in a leather jacket. He saw the nod Keanu had given him, that sad, respectful nod. It haunted him. It was a sign of grace that the pilot didn't deserve. As the lights of New York City began to twinkle in the distance, signaling the end of their journey, The pilot felt a profound sense of dread. He didn't want to land. He didn't want to face the passengers, knowing what he had done. He knew that when he walked out of the airport, there would likely be reporters or at least people talking. The secret was out. He realized that while he would wake up tomorrow and go back to his job, and the sun would rise and the world would keep turning, he would never forget this night. He had used his power to hurt a good man. And as the wheels of the plane lowered and locked into place for landing, the captain knew that this was one mistake that couldn't be fixed with an apology or a new flight. The damage was done. The door was closed, and the weight of it was heavier than any cargo he had ever carried. The wheels of the airplane touched down on the runway with a soft screech, followed by the rumble of the engines reversing to slow the heavy machine down. Outside the cockpit windows, the lights of New York City blurred past, a sea of gold and white stretching to the horizon. The landing was smooth, textbook perfect, exactly the kind of landing the pilot had performed thousands of times before. But tonight, there was no sense of accomplishment in his chest. There was only a hollow, aching emptiness. He taxied the plane toward the gate, his hands moving automatically on the controls, flipping switches and turning dials. He spoke to the control tower, his voice steady and professional, giving the right commands at the right times. But his mind was far away. It was back at the departure gate, replaying the image of the man in the leather jacket walking away. Every time the runway lights flashed by his window, he saw the desperate look in Keanu's eyes. As the plane came to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the cabin erupted in the usual sounds of travel. People unclicking belts, opening overhead bins, shuffling bags, and turning on phones. The chatter began immediately, about the weather, about dinner plans, about the meetings waiting for them in the morning. The pilot sat in his seat for a long moment, listening to this noise of life continuing, indifferent to the small tragedy he had caused earlier in the night. "Great landing, Captain," the co-pilot said, starting to shut down his instruments. The pilot nodded slowly, not looking at him. "Thanks." He stood up and adjusted his uniform cap. He felt like a fraud. The uniform represented authority and responsibility, and tonight he felt he had failed at the most important part of that responsibility, caring for people. He grabbed his flight bag and opened the cockpit door. He stepped into the galley where the flight attendants were gathering their things. They smiled at him, tired but friendly. "Have a good night, Captain," one of them said. "You too," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He walked down the aisle, avoiding eye contact with the passengers. He felt like if anyone looked at him too closely, they would see the guilt written all over his face. He knew it was irrational. None of these people knew what had happened, but the weight of his secret was heavy. When he exited the jet bridge and walked into the busy terminal, the noise was overwhelming. It was late, but JFK Airport was still alive. He walked toward the ground transportation area, his footsteps echoing on the floor. He passed a newsstand. The televisions mounted on the wall were muted, but the headlines were scrolling across the bottom. He saw a photo of a familiar face. It was a still image from the movie set Keanu had left earlier that day. Then the image changed to a blurry photo of a man walking away from a gate. The caption underneath read, "Reeves misses flight Stansby for next departure." The pilot stopped in his tracks. He stood there in the middle of the flowing river of travelers, people brushing past him with carts and suitcases. He stared at the screen. So he had made it onto the next flight. Or at least he was waiting for it. A wave of relief washed over the pilot, mixed with a sharp sting of shame. He was glad the man had found another way, but he hated that he had been the one to put that extra obstacle in his path. He walked over to a quiet corner of the terminal near a floor-to-ceiling window. He pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking slightly as he opened a social media app. He needed to know more. He needed to know if the story was real or just internet gossip. He found a live stream from outside a hospital in New York. A small crowd of reporters and fans were gathered near the entrance. The comments were scrolling by fast. "Praying for him. Hope he makes it. He's such a good guy." Then the camera zoomed in. A dark SUV pulled up to the curb. The back door opened and a man stepped out. It was him. Keanu looked even more tired than he had at the airport. He was wearing the same clothes. He didn't look at the cameras. He didn't wave. He just looked at the hospital entrance with a look of pure focus. He nodded to the driver and hurried toward the sliding glass doors. The pilot watched the tiny screen, holding his breath. He saw Keanu disappear into the hospital. The reporter on the video was speaking, but the pilot read the closed captions. Reeves arrived shortly after midnight. Sources say his friend is still holding on. The pilot let out a long breath that he felt he had been holding for hours. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the terminal window. It was over. Keanu had made it. The pilot hadn't succeeded in stopping him, only in delaying him. But as he stood there, looking at his own reflection in the glass, he realized that the delay was unnecessary. It was caused by his own ego, his own stubborn adherence to the rules, and his own quick judgment. He thought about the friend inside that hospital room. He thought about how much those extra hours of waiting must have hurt. He thought about the fear of not being there when someone you love takes their last breath. It was a pain the pilot hoped he never had to feel, and he had added to that pain even if just a little. "I'm sorry," he whispered to his reflection. It wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the past. But it was all he had. He put his phone away. He picked up his bag and turned his back on the television screens. He walked toward the exit where his hotel shuttle was waiting. The night air was cool when he stepped outside. The city smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. He got into the van and sat in the back seat. The driver asked, "Rough flight?" The pilot looked out the window as the van merged onto the highway. "No," he said quietly, "the flight was fine. I was the one who wasn't." He spent the ride to the hotel thinking about how he would change. He knew he couldn't bend every rule for every person. That wasn't safe either. But he promised himself that from now on he would look harder. He would listen longer. He would remember that underneath the uniforms, the tickets, and the schedules, everyone was just a human being trying to get somewhere important. The next morning, the pilot woke up to a notification on his phone. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He opened the news feed. The headline was simple: "Actor says final goodbye to childhood friend." The article said that Keanu had arrived in time. He had sat by the bedside for 3 hours. He had held his friend's hand. They had talked about the old days, just like Keanu had wanted. His friend had passed away peacefully just after sunrise, with the person he cared about most right there beside him. The pilot read the words over and over. Tears pricked his eyes, hot and stinging. He was happy for Keanu. He was happy that his friend hadn't died alone in a sterile room, wondering where his best friend was. But the pilot also felt a deep, resonating sadness for himself. He realized that while Keanu had been given a second chance to say goodbye, the pilot would never get a chance to say he was sorry. He would never get to look Keanu in the eye and tell him that he was wrong. That interaction at the gate was frozen in time, a moment of failure that he would carry with him forever. He got out of bed and went to the window. He looked out at the city skyline. The sun was coming up, painting the buildings in gold. It was a beautiful, fresh start to the day for millions of people. For the pilot, it was the beginning of a different kind of journey. He wasn't flying a plane today. He was flying himself, trying to navigate being a better man. He thought about the nod Keanu had given him at the gate, that respectful, dignified nod. At the time, he thought it was submission. Now he understood it was grace. Keanu had shown him grace when he didn't deserve it, and that lesson was worth more than any perfect flight record. The pilot showered, shaved, and put on his uniform. He looked in the mirror. He straightened his tie. He looked the same, but he felt different. He picked up his bag and headed out the door to catch the shuttle back to the airport. He had a flight to command later that afternoon. There would be new passengers, new faces, and new stories, and this time he promised himself he would really see them.